In the early hours of August 3, 2032, an elite Russian assault team quietly slipped through a forest deep inside the NATO-allied country of Estonia. Their target, the Lenubas Air Force Base, located approximately 35 kilometers southwest of the Estonian capital of Tallinn. The lightly defended airbase proved no match for the surprise Russian attack. Within moments, the defenders of the airbase were overrun, outside communications were cut, and the control tower seized. Minutes later, 4 civilian passenger jets off the Baltic coast suddenly broke contact with their controllers, descended and landed at the airbase. Russian forces quickly disembarked, paving the way for the tens of thousands of forces soon to follow from air, sea, and land. The invasion of the Baltics had begun, and with it, World War III. Much like Germany's downfall after World War I, Russia found itself politically, economically, and militarily devastated following its failed attempt to seize Ukraine in 2022. Following years of staggering military losses, the Russian public ached for new leadership and a return to the glory days back when the Soviet Union was a superpower feared by countries across the globe. They would receive that leadership through a charismatic new firebrand Russian president, the former first deputy director of the Federal Security Service, or FSB, Dmitry Kozak, who took power after a swift and bloody coup in late 2026. In 6 short years, Kozak overhauled and restructured the military, investing billions into smaller, more agile and highly trained conventional forces, while procuring large numbers of Chinese exported armor, air defense systems, drones, and naval warships. A stopgap solution while Russia rebuilt its domestically produced military inventory. But time was not on Kozak's side. With an unsustainable military budget built on an anemic, isolated economy and a fickle, anxious populace, Kozak knew that his vision of a new empire must be implemented soon. His solution came from the East. Seeking his own legacy and believing that time and circumstances were both right and fleeting, Premier Liu Hao of China formed an alliance with Russian President Kozak. Together, they would devise a secret coordinated military plan designed to dominate Europe, Asia, and the shipping lanes critical to global trade. It was called Operation Resurgence. It was to begin in Europe with a lightning Russian invasion of the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, reclaiming those countries lost to Russia following the fall of the Soviet Union. Seizing them would provide a critical land bridge from Russia to Kaliningrad, granting Russia's navy greater influence over the Baltic Sea and the Russian army, a direct doorway into Western Europe. Kozak and Hao were fully aware that the invasion would trigger a massive NATO military response. In fact, they counted on it, as once NATO became firmly mobilized, focused and committed to a war against Russia in Europe, China would then initiate the second phase of Operation Resurgence, the invasion of Taiwan. Both Kozak and Hao were firm in their belief that the United States, a country politically fractured and distracted from within, would not have the will to mobilize, the unity to weather the economic blow, or the stomach to incur enormous losses for places few in the US knew of or cared about. For the United States and its allies, like they had nearly a century before during World War II, together could they once again rally, battle and win a two-front war a half a world apart? Or through failure, miscalculation or insanity, would it all come to an end in the blinding flash of nuclear annihilation? The world was about to find out. "32,000 feet over the Gulf of Riga, a NATO surveillance aircraft turned lazy circles in a moonless sky. The crew aboard were on alert, their powerful radar peering deep into Russian territory at the suspicious forces massing for what the Kremlin had called a snap military exercise. NATO was skeptical. With Russian President Dmitry Kozak's recent military expansion and his bellicose threats against the West, the thin but potent NATO forces in the Baltics were wary and had responded by increasing their readiness. In Washington, President Dalman and his administration were dismissive of NATO's concern, believing Russia incapable of mounting offensive operations in Europe. Instead, the Dalman administration's primary attention was fixed on the Pacific Rim and the ongoing struggle there for regional dominance against China. Aboard the surveillance aircraft over the Baltics, NATO's worries were confirmed on August 3rd, when radar operators identified a wave of incoming tactical ballistic missiles from the east. Their trajectories and points of impact were soon determined. The missiles were headed for the Baltics. As one of the radar operators put it, "Buckle up, kids, here comes the pain." The Russian offensive began with a rain of missiles, long-range artillery fire, and thousands of drones, targeting facilities throughout Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Airports, radar and power stations, fuel depots, ammunition storage facilities and surface-to-air missile batteries were simultaneously struck. Russian aircraft followed, with NATO fighter aircraft racing to meet the attack. As the crowded skies over the Baltics filled with aircraft, missiles and flaming wreckage, down below, the leading elements of the Russian ground offensive began their assault. In the north, along Highway E20 near the city of Narva, Estonian ground forces fought hard against the onslaught of Russian tanks, infantry fighting vehicles and attack helicopters, all under the withering support of artillery and rocket fire. Lieutenant Jan Lukas of the Estonian ground forces described the chaos in the battle for Narva. Almost immediately, our vehicle was hit by a missile. Only me and the driver were able to get out. We got picked up by another vehicle and hadn't gone 100 meters when it was also hit by a missile. This time, nobody made it out but me. Only reason I'm not dead or a POW is because a civilian who was positively mental picked me up and got me out of there while under fire. Suffering significant losses, the defenders were eventually driven west, but their efforts gave valuable time for follow-on forces to gather and prepare for the defense of the city of Jovi, considered critical in faltering the Russians' northern advance. While in the south from Kaliningrad, Russian forces made rapid work of overwhelming and destroying the small Lithuanian tripwire defense force staged at the city of Cyberattack. To the city's east, combined Lithuanian and NATO ground forces prepared positions in the city of Mariampol for tough fighting ahead. But the largest Russian assault was focused on eastern Latvia and their goal of seizing the capital city of Riga within the war's first 60 hours. Doing so would effectively cut the Baltics in half, leaving Estonia and Lithuania isolated and desperately vulnerable to defeat. Standing in the Russians' way was a NATO battalion-strength multinational battle group, led by Canadian Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Bornett. Anticipating the Russians' plan, Bornett had the bulk of his forces staged near the Latvian city of Rēzekne. Over a live emergency video conference, US President Dalman and other NATO heads of state were given a briefing by NATO command, including by Lieutenant Colonel Bornett from his temporary headquarters in Rēzekne. Bornett made it clear that holding Rēzekne was critical. "The bulk of the Russian attack will be directed here," he told the gathering. "If we hold Rēzekne, we stall the Russians. We stall them, they lose." Looking for reassurance, President Dalman asked Bornett directly of his chances of holding the city until reinforcements from Poland and elsewhere could arrive. Bornett was confident. "We will hold." The lieutenant colonel's video feed suddenly ceased. It would later be determined that Russian hackers had accessed Bornett's personal phone months prior, giving Russian intelligence real-time access to Bornett's location. Breaking strict security rules, Bornett's personal phone was in his pocket in the opening hours of the Russian attack. 3 hypersonic missiles slammed into his building. President Dalman, desperate for an update, finally received confirmation of Bornett's fate 3 hours later. The lieutenant colonel, his aides and leading officers were dead. Horrified, the stricken president was heard to say, "This is disaster upon disaster." The decapitating attack left Bornett's brigade stunned, shaken but resolute. Digging in, they prepared for the brutal fight soon to come. Meanwhile, 60 kilometers to the west, in the eastern Latvian village of Rēzekne, a farmer was startled to see dark shapes thundering over his field. The wraiths were 2 Latvian Apache attack helicopters, racing toward the threatened city of Rēzekne, home to 30,000 civilians, and the nation's main line of defense against the sudden Russian attack. Aboard Rapier 1, Lieutenant Janis Pudelis was anxious. As he scanned the terrain ahead in search of targets, he could hear radio calls in his ear coming from friendly forces defending Rēzekne that were growing increasingly frantic, the calls for air support, increasingly desperate. 10 clicks out, Pudelis announced to the pilot. Armed with Hellfire missiles, the Apaches were now in range to meet whatever ground forces lay ahead. They were also well within range of deadly Russian anti-aircraft missiles. Hiding below the treetops, the Apaches popped up to see what they were facing. What Lieutenant Pudelis was able to see horrified him. Appearing out of the east was an ocean of incoming tanks and armored vehicles. Within moments, Rapiers 1 and 2 emptied their Hellfires, turning 12 enemy vehicles into incinerated wreckage. It was nowhere near enough. As his Apache ducked away from incoming missile fire, Lieutenant Pudelis summed up their effort as they raced back to base to rearm. Said Pudelis, "We are just spitting into a forest fire." With the goal of conquering the Latvian city of Riga within the first 60 hours of the war, effectively severing the Baltics in half, the Russians first needed to seize the pivotal city of Rēzekne, where 2 key highways, the A13 and the A12, converge. Blocking their advance into Rēzekne was a NATO battalion-strength multinational battle group. Outnumbered and outgunned, the NATO forces also found themselves in momentary disarray, having lost their commanding officer and several of his staff in a missile strike. Regardless, their mission was clear. They were ordered to hold Rēzekne at all cost. In the wooded high ground, north of the village of Sondor, Canadian and Latvian infantry armed with anti-tank missiles and backed by Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, prepared to hit the enemy's advance down Highway A13, while to the southeast near the village of Ignașani, a platoon of Leopard A2 battle tanks waited to meet the enemy on Highway A12. Commanding the platoon, Lieutenant Artis Rimzewicz recalled the initial moments of the attack. It became something like a science fiction movie. Everywhere the tracers were like laser fire, missiles and rounds like photon torpedoes, and the noise. Between the autocannons, tank rounds, the missiles, the artillery, the explosions and people screaming, it all worked against you to dull your senses, to make you slow. What shook me out of it was when I saw one of my Leopards brew up. Everyone I trained and led in that vehicle was instantly dead forever. It was then that I gave the order to fall back to our next line of defense. By mid-morning, that defense had compressed into the city of Rēzekne itself, as fighting became a house-to-house, nose-to-nose battle for survival. "For hours we bloodied them good," said Lieutenant Rimzewicz, who had lost his own Leopard tank and was now on foot. "But in the end, there were just too damn many of them." By afternoon, the NATO forces in Rēzekne were broken and isolated. Surviving soldiers and entire units of those who remained began to surrender. Not all were taken prisoner. Within a stone's throw of Rēzekne's iconic castle ruins, 12 NATO combat engineers surrendered to Russian forces of the 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, led by Colonel Oleg Nagamov. Nagamov made it clear that he had neither the time, the resources, nor the patience to manage prisoners. The 12 were lined up along the bank of the Rēzekne River, and as Nagamov drove away, he ordered their cold-blooded execution. Shot and dumped into the river, one of the 12 soldiers would survive. Hours later and miles downstream, Captain Marcus Kellaway pulled himself from the river and escaped into the woods, exhausted, but with only a grazing wound to his shoulder. In the days ahead, Kellaway, along with a scattering of others who escaped capture or execution that day, would form a team to operate behind enemy lines, becoming a constant, relentless and dangerous thorn in the Russians' proverbial flank. earning Kellaway's team both fame and a nickname, the Rēzekne Raiders, by both friends and enemies alike. Meanwhile, with Rēzekne taken, the road to Riga was now open. So too was the fate of the Baltics. At an airbase 60 kilometers east of the Polish city of Poznan, analysts from the US National Security Agency were reviewing the latest COMINT, or communications intelligence, pouring in from the Baltics and Western Russia. The room was tense. With the Baltics at war, the small NSA team was assigned the critical task of flagging any and all communications regarding two key Russian military units, the 152nd Missile Brigade based in Kaliningrad and the 26th Missile Brigade in Western Russia. It was these two Russian units, stationed closest to the Baltics, that were armed with numerous mobile tactical nuclear ballistic missiles. Elusive, powerful, and immeasurably deadly, knowing where these mobile units were and what they were planning was of the utmost concern to both the United States and NATO. With the Russian invasion of the Baltics only hours old, NSA analyst David Massey soon identified cell phone traffic originating from within the 152nd Missile Brigade in Kaliningrad. As he read the transcript, Massey suddenly went pale. Asked by another analyst what he was seeing, Massey responded, "Good God, it's happening." The missiles were on the move. Meanwhile, en route to the United States European Command headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany, General Erich Radek, head of EUCOM, was receiving real-time reports of the Russian invasion of the Baltics. The news was not good. In the north, reports were coming in from Estonia that the city of Jovi had fallen, with Russian ground forces now less than 100 kilometers from the capital city of Tallinn. While in the south, heavy fighting was taking place in the Lithuanian city of Mariupol, as Russian forces attempted to push eastward in order to sever the two key arteries connecting Lithuania to Poland. But the most distressing news was out of Latvia. With the collapse of defenses in the city of Rēzekne, the Russians were quickly advancing along Highway E22 and were now on the outskirts of Decapitating. Despite repeated aerial attacks on the advancing convoys and having received considerable aircraft losses, the river of Russian armored vehicles continued marching on for Riga. The news was about to get a lot worse. General Radek received a flash message from Washington. Intelligence had confirmed that multiple tactical nuclear missile units from the Russian 152nd Missile Brigade in Kaliningrad were on the move. They were headed for Lithuania. That answered what had been a burning question for General Radek: how Russian President Dmitry Kozak actually expected to hold the Baltics, even if his invasion succeeded, given that NATO would launch a massive combined counterattack. President Kozak intended to use the missiles as the ultimate negotiation tool. That once the Baltics were seized and annexed to Russia, and with the missiles scattered and hidden throughout, NATO would have no choice but to consider whether to escalate the war to a potentially nuclear level or negotiate for peace. As General Radek put it, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Only this time, we're already at war. Up to that point, there was considerable debate within NATO as to how to approach the coming NATO counterattack. Some lobbied to keep the war contained strictly within the Baltic countries, avoiding direct attacks on Russian territory, including Kaliningrad, all in the hopes of avoiding wider escalation. As one official stated, "It's notable the Russians have not hit Poland or Germany or anywhere else beyond the Baltics." Kozak, it appeared, was hoping to contain the fight. Others had a less restricted view and advocated hitting Russian military targets wherever and however, including within Russia itself. News that Russian tactical nukes were headed for the Baltics settled the NATO debate. The order came to General Radek: destroy the missile units in Kaliningrad. Within hours, a hastily organized strike package of F-35s and supporting aircraft was making its way above the rolling hills of northern Poland toward Highway E28, as satellite surveillance transmitted real-time updates of the missile vehicles' locations. Time was of the essence, as the surveillance could not be guaranteed for long. Paving the way was a wave of NATO missiles and aircraft meant to suppress or destroy a narrow path through Kaliningrad's extensive anti-aircraft network. It proved marginally effective. Though several SAM sites were struck or jammed, an F-35, 2 UAVs and an F-18 Growler were lost. Near the city of Nestorov, less than 10 kilometers from the Lithuanian border, the remaining F-35s released their bombs. In this, they were 100% effective. Of the 4 Russian missile vehicles targeted, all 4 were destroyed. General Rēzekne was later asked by a reporter if destroying the vehicles posed a risk of a nuclear detonation or radiation fallout. Said Rēzekne, "We felt the risk of succumbing to nuclear terrorism was greater." Rēzekne was then asked if NATO had taken out all the nuclear missile units headed for the Baltics. "Yes," he answered. He was wrong. And as events began to spiral, the war that had once been locally confined was now about to spill well beyond the Baltic borders. "200 kilometers off the coast of Scotland, the 320-meter tanker, the Seawise Giant, sailed with a full load of oil bound for the northern coast of Spain. Having left the Sullom Voe oil and gas terminal in the Shetland Islands hours earlier, the ship was making only 10 knots against a gusting North Sea wind. Aboard the ship, the crew showed little awareness nor interest in the far-off war taking place in the Baltics. With the war into its 3rd day, the belief among many was that the conflict was strictly a regional one, confined to the Baltics alone. They were woefully mistaken. Hours earlier, NATO conducted an airstrike inside Kaliningrad, destroying several of Russia's mobile tactical nukes. Russia was now prepared for retribution, aiming deep into the heart of NATO. Aboard the Seawise Giant, crew members were unaware of their mortal peril as a single Russian Zircon anti-ship missile approached. Designed as a carrier killer, the missile slammed into the defenseless ship at a speed nearing Mach 8. The tanker sank within moments, taking her entire crew with her and sending a torrent of over 1 million gallons of burning oil into the water. From across the North Sea, more missiles were in the air, bound for targets critical to NATO. War had come to Western Europe. Prior to the invasion, Russian President Dmitry Kozak gambled that the war he was to initiate against the countries of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania would remain there, that NATO would be adverse to expanding the fight beyond the Baltic borders. That hope ended with NATO's airstrike inside Russian territory. Furious, and by some accounts shaken by the news of the Kaliningrad attack, Kozak ordered the launch of Operation Rift. Prepared as a contingency months in advance, the objective of Operation Rift was to cripple oil and gas production in the North Sea, sending a clear message to the leading members of NATO that their countries were not immune to Russia's military reach. Below the surface of the North Sea, 2 Russian Yasen-class submarines kicked off the operation, launching their payload of hypersonic cruise missiles. Traveling at nearly 11,000 kilometers per hour, the missiles soon reached their targets, striking 3 oil and gas platforms off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, as well as the oil tanker, the Ariel, and the offshore support vessel, the Foinaven, killing hundreds, severing oil and gas production throughout the North Sea, and initiating what would later be the largest offshore rescue operation in human history. Farther south, the strike proved less effective as a wave of missiles targeting the Central Area Transmission System, a natural gas processing terminal in northeast England, was intercepted by a UK Sky Sabre air defence system, providing a brief but dramatic fireworks display for citizens in the coastal city of Sunderland. Meanwhile, to the far north, racing over the Norwegian Sea, 3 Blackjack bombers originating from the Olenja Air Base on the Kola Peninsula released their own missiles. These targeted oil and gas platforms west of the Shetland Islands, as well as the Sullom Voe oil and gas terminal. Arriving unopposed, the Russian missiles struck their targets, killing 240, damaging or destroying numerous facilities and cutting power to much of the Shetland Islands for months. At the Evacuation air station in northern Norway, 2 of a total of 4 F-35s scrambled to intercept the Russian aircraft, as the Blackjack bombers gave a wide berth to the mainland for their flight back to base. Rocketing northward over Andoya in pursuit, Lieutenant Colonel Bjorn Enoksen calculated his chances of success. With drop tanks installed, his F-35's range was extended, but it came at the cost of both stealth and speed. He judged that catching the blackjacks was going to be a very near thing. In the end, it wasn't. 150 miles out over the Norwegian Sea, Enoksen and his wingmen received urgent orders to turn back. Air defense stations at Banak had detected a new flight of Russian aircraft on a course for what appeared to be a cruise missile strike on the Evenes air station. Turning to the south, Lieutenant Colonel Enoksen could only watch in frustration as the blackjacks slipped away. His frustration turning to fury as he would later learn that the incoming Russian airstrike had been a simple feint, designed to draw off Norway's thin combat air patrol in the north. "If NATO doesn't get us more fighters and a carrier up here," Enoksen fumed, "the Russians can keep doing this until they run out of goddamn cruise missiles. Or run out of targets." Hours later, in the Barents Sea, a telescoping mast rose from the depths, its thermographic eye sweeping the surface for danger. Below, in the control room of HMS Audacious, the Royal Navy's advanced Astute-class attack submarine, Commander Edward Bass eyed the video feed from above. It showed that his boat was alone. He'd anticipated as such, as hours before he'd been ordered to leave his station off the coast of Murmansk, where he'd been monitoring Russia's northern fleet and head several hundred miles north. As Bass put it, to the very middle of nowhere. The question was, why? He'd soon get his answer from Northwood headquarters. Along with news of Russia's shocking cruise missile attack on oil and gas facilities in both the North Sea and the eastern coast of the UK, the latest message also contained new orders. Proceed northwest of Novaya Zemlya. Conduct T-LAM strike on the following targets. Commander Bass turned to his XO, his face grim. He gave the order to dive. The Audacious was going to war. While HMS Audacious prepared its attack from the Barents Sea, staff at the US Navy's Theater Undersea Surveillance Command in Virginia were waging their own battle, assisting NATO forces in the North Sea and their hunt for the two Russian Yasen-class submarines that carried out the UK missile attack. The subs were now attempting to slip away, one intending to hide amongst the sonar clutter along the rugged Norwegian coast, the other heading for deeper waters north of the Shetland Islands. The Russian crews were confident in their skill, and the stealth of the Yasen-class sub, a weapon considered the crown jewel in the Russian Navy, and arguably comparable to Western-designed attack subs. They would soon learn their confidence was misplaced. From the moment the subs fired their missiles, the US Navy's vast integrated undersea surveillance system pinpointed their exact locations. In truth, their locations had been known for some time. Days before the war began, NATO tracked the subs as they entered the North Sea and were being shadowed by a US Orca unmanned undersea vehicle and a US Virginia-class submarine, the Montana. The rules of engagement for NATO's naval forces had been to hold fire unless Russian naval units fired first, the hope being that the Russians would be averse to committing their naval forces to the war, and thus keep both sides from potentially losing their most prized and expensive military assets. That hope died in the North Sea. Within moments of the attack, anti-submarine forces from the UK, US and Norway converged on the Russian subs. First to fire was the unmanned Orca. Carrying a single Mark 46 torpedo, it would be the Orca's first time firing a weapon at a real-world target. In Virginia, naval staff soon heard the telltale explosions as the Yasen sub, the Kazan, began its terminal dive to the seabed. To the northeast, UK anti-sub aircraft and a Norwegian frigate closed in on the Voronezh, its location being fed by the shadowing USS Montana. Like a sniper's spotter, the Montana led the hunters to the hunted, silently leaving others to deliver the fatal blow, thus ensuring the Montana's stealth and ability to hunt again. Within mere hours of the Russian attack, both subs, along with the bodies of 165 sailors, lay at the bottom of the North Sea. Far to the north, HMS Audacious continued NATO's retribution. In the North Barents Sea, a volley of cruise missiles broke the surface, each skimming just feet above the water while skirting the northern coast of Novaya Zemlya to avoid detection before turning south for the Russian mainland. Their mission, to cripple Russia's oil and gas industry in the Arctic, an investment that cost billions and took decades to create. As the missiles closed in, An official from the UK Ministry of Defence joked, "There's about to be a whole new version of the Northern Lights over Russia." In quick succession, Tomahawk cruise missiles slammed into the Yamal, Arctic II, and SVNT liquefied natural gas facilities, as well as the nuclear icebreaker, the Yakutia, turning the facilities to rubble and sinking the icebreaker in port. But the bulk of the attack centered on the newly constructed Sever Bay oil terminal on the West Taimyr Peninsula. Built at considerable expense in the 2020s, it was by far Russia's largest oil terminal to date, capable of producing 100 million tons per year. Of the 15 Tomahawks targeting the terminal, 6 were shot down by surface-to-air missiles. The rest struck home. The blast and secondary explosions were devastating. As one civilian worker later described it, everything was vaporized, flattened as if nuked. The number of dead have yet to be known, and may never be. The Russians claim 4,000, while NATO estimates somewhere near 500. Aboard HMS Audacious, Commander Bass, forgoing any celebratory action, instead quietly ordered a new course, northwest under the ice shelf, to slip away before the Russians came hunting. Back in the Baltics, the ground war raged on. Near the city of Alytus on Highway 132, Lithuanian resident Simonas Navikas was growing increasingly anxious. Having fled the capital city of Vilnius with his family hours earlier, and with reports of heavy fighting taking place in the city of Mariupol to the west, Highway 132 now served the last remaining artery out of the war zone to the safety of the Polish border, and it was now clogged and stalled with refugees. Suppressing his own fear, Navikas assured his family that the battle was still far away, that no one would attack unarmed civilians. Then he saw a small, dark shape appear in the sky to the north, an aircraft coming in low and fast. "The way it was lining up on us," said Navikas, "like a predator. You just knew it was coming to kill us all." The highway was a primary target for Russian military planners, with every bomb crater, every disabled vehicle and mine serving to slow and delay any potential NATO ground force attempting to counterattack from Poland. But with the war barely 48 hours old, the only vehicles to be found on Highway 132 were civilian. Above them, a lone Russian Su-25 ground attack aircraft released its payload of cluster bombs. In an instant, the endless line of vehicles was turned into a shattered river of fire. Simonas Navikas would survive the attack, wounded but alive. Tragically, his wife and children would not. As Navikas and scores of other shattered survivors staggered through the carnage, a common cry was heard. How could this happen? Where was the military? Where was NATO? At United States European Command Headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany, General Erich Radik, head of EUCOM, agonized in silence over the pace of NATO's response to the Russian invasion of the Baltics. From Warsaw to London to Washington, D.C., the heated demand for immediate military action was growing. So too was that heat directed at Radik himself, with some pundits in the media calling the general cautious and timid. Radik tried to ignore the noise, but he bristled at the legion of Monday morning quarterbacks. The situation in Europe required a far more comprehensive and complex solution than what the talking heads on television were offering. Though he had a potent ground force pre-positioned and at his command in both Germany and Poland, it was a force designed to defend against and deter the Russians. As Radik made clear to those who would listen, it was not enough to go on the offensive. Not all agreed. Poland, in particular, threatened to advance its own significant armor and mechanized force into Lithuania to buffer and defend the Suwałki Gap. Radik argued against it, telling the Polish Minister of Defense in a meeting that, at times, grew heated. "We kicked Iraq's ass because we waited to go on the offensive during the first Gulf War. Respectfully," he said, "there's a reason we went from Operation Desert Shield to Operation Desert Storm. What we sure as hell didn't do is go with Operation Desert Drizzle instead." In Radik's opinion, NATO was far from yet orchestrating a successful storm. Though Russia had a diminished force from decades prior, what it did have was still modern, numerous and formidable. Attacking it piecemeal would invite disaster. His argument, for the moment, convinced Poland against going it alone. He conceded, however, that every minute that passed without further boots on the ground meant more Baltic land given over to Russia. That if the capital cities of Riga, Tallinn and Vilnius fell, and the governments with them, retaking the Baltics would be that much more difficult, costly and deadly, both for NATO forces and Baltic civilians alike. What General Rēzekne needed in the short term was to slow the Russian advance, to bog them down and delay them enough while he continued to gather forces for an overwhelming ground offensive soon to come. To that end, Rēzekne authorized what was to be called Operation Bulwark. Devised long in advance for just such a scenario, the objective of Bulwark was to utilize two quick response forces, the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit, currently embarked with the Bataan Amphibious Ready Group, southeast of Copenhagen, and the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team stationed in Italy. With orders to ring, hold, and defend the capital cities of Riga and Tallinn, thus drawing the Russians into a lengthy and bloody fight in terrain that favored the defenders. Vilnius, deemed too vulnerable with its proximity to Russia and Belarus, was for the moment off the operation list. Lithuania's defense would have to come later. The commanders of the 26th and the 173rd were, as expected, supremely confident in the success of their mission. Rēzekne hoped to God they were right. As the amphibious fleet made its way into the Baltic Sea and paratroopers boarded their aircrafts, he considered the outcomes. Prone to analogies, Rēzekne told an aide, "Once on the ground, there's no getting them out. This will either succeed like the Pusan perimeter during the Korean War, or," he said, "or I just signed their death warrant on the Bataan Peninsula." With dawn and D-Day just hours away, General Rēzekne and history would soon learn the outcome. In the waters of Tallinn Bay, 6 miles northwest of the Estonian capital city, U.S. Marine Corps First Lieutenant Louis Roscoe looked out into the blackness, his night vision catching sight of a fellow landing craft of the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit as it made its way for the shoreline, while helicopters and fast-moving aircraft flashed by overhead. Like the other 1,200 Marines in the battalion landing team, Louis's thoughts were focused on the tasks ahead. His emotions a jumbled soup of excitement, calm and trepidation. Though the landing in Estonia was not to be a Normandy-like storming of a contested beach, as Russian ground forces were still more than 40 miles east of Tallinn, the landing site was still well within the range of deadly Russian air and missile strikes, be they conventional, chemical, or in the nightmare scenario, nuclear. Before boarding his landing craft, Louis wrote in his journal, "Overall, our confidence is high, but so is the pucker factor." This would be the first time in generations that the US Marine Corps would face a modern peer state in a real-world battleground. For Louis, all of it felt surreal, like being a participant in someone else's movie. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion turned the surrounding sea to daylight as the Constellation-class frigate, the USS Chesapeake, erupted into a massive ball of flame. Though the bay had been swept for mines, it proved difficult, if not impossible, to hunt down and destroy the Russians' unmanned underwater kamikaze drones that lay silent, dormant and often hidden in the clutter of old wrecks. One of those autonomous drones had activated and found the Chesapeake. From 3 miles away, Louis could see men leaping into the water, some in flames, as helicopters raced to rescue survivors from the doomed ship. Louis and his men watched it all in silence, their first experience with the deadly consequences of war. Sadly, it would not be their last, and D-Day had only just begun. Operation Bulwark began with the simultaneous insertion of the US 173rd Airborne Brigade into Latvia and the US Marines' 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit into Estonia. The objectives were to secure the capital cities of Tallinn and Riga, slow and delay the Russians' advance from the east, and provide the critical time needed for NATO to gather forces for a powerful future counterattack from Poland. But first, the 26th and the 173rd needed to get boots safely on the ground. Doing so in the modern age of warfare, where intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance were ubiquitous and in real time, where once an enemy unit was seen it could be killed within moments, meant that the mission of becoming unseen was paramount. Racing over the Baltic Sea, Pilot Lieutenant Commander Joe Kunzler, along with Electronic Warfare Officer Lieutenant Preet Sangha, led the way in a flight of EA-18G Growlers, their electronic systems designed to jam, deafen and blind Russia's local radar, sensor and communications networks. It was the Growlers that would first kick off Operation Bulwark, firing their loadout of air-to-surface missiles at Russian radar sites. Meanwhile, scores of NATO and Russian fighter aircraft were tangling for supremacy of the skies over the eastern Baltics. A retired college professor in the Estonian town of Kalaste recounted what he saw. It was like a man-made thunderstorm, he said. The sonic booms, the missiles streaking across the sky, the flaming wreckage raining down. I watched it all in terrible awe. The next morning, he discovered a single boot in his yard, still holding the foot of a lost pilot. Despite painful losses suffered on both sides, air superiority, if but briefly, tipped to NATO's favor. It bought enough time to bring in the ground troops. Crossing over the Baltic Sea south of Stockholm, Sweden, an aerial convoy of heavy lift aircraft carried the 173rd Airborne Brigade into Latvia. By dawn, more than 3,000 paratroopers were on the ground and dispersed between the Riga International Airport, the Spilve Airfield, and the former ex-Soviet Rumbula Air Base, the last of which requiring bulldozers to clear debris off the dormant runway that was most recently used for drag racing. To the southeast, 3 companies from the 173rd parachuted in near the city of Koknese to bolster NATO and Latvian ground forces in their tactical withdrawal from the city of Decapitating. The airborne assault proved a success, with key defensive positions established by mid-afternoon in and around Riga at the cost of 6 American dead, 5 from a single Russian rocket attack, and 1 shot by a local farmer who mistook the American for Russian. Further north, as Marines made their way to shore in Tallinn Bay, the need to be unseen by the enemy was at its zenith, where a single missile attack on the landing ships or the landing zone itself could end the operation in disaster. Combined with NATO's localized electronic warfare efforts, the US also implemented a brief but powerful cyber attack on satellite, communications, tactical ballistic, and air defense systems inside Russia's western military district. Yet unproven in war, the attack, along with decoy air and sea drones operating north of Tallinn, provided enough deception to divert incoming Russian missiles, those that were not shot down, to explode harmlessly into the sea, into expendable drones, or into targets that had been evacuated long before. It would be hours later when Russia learned that despite electronic intelligence pointing to a US Marine landing in the port of Tallinn, the true landing site was Struumi Beach, some 3 miles west of the city. Though local social media posts showed footage of the landing, it was initially dismissed by Russian intelligence, believing it disinformation. As men and equipment rapidly offloaded at Struumi Beach, US Marines suffered their worst losses of the day 25 miles west, near the Paldiski ferry terminal, when a pair of fully loaded V-22 Ospreys were shot down by enemy shoulder-fired missiles during an aerial assault of the terminal. "Seeing them both auger in," said another pilot. "You hope to God, but you know there's no way they're walking away from that." Despite the losses, and after heavy fighting, the ferry terminal was later secured, allowing follow-on forces to move in for the forthcoming mission to isolate and destroy the Russian forces operating out of the seized Air Force Base southwest of Tallinn. As evening set in, the cost of the first day of Operation Bulwark could be tallied, with NATO forces suffering 148 casualties and 38 civilians killed. Russian media reported a mere 75 casualties, a total widely disputed even by military bloggers inside Russia. While the fires in the port still burned and missile alerts continued to blare, Lieutenant Louis Roscoe looked out over the city of Tallinn and considered himself lucky. He'd survived D-Day. He had no illusions of what was next. He wrote prophetically in his journal, "The worst is yet to come." Earlier, above the Latvian city of Vilnius, a network of aerial drones scanned the terrain, their electronic eyes searching for threats and targets to the northwest of the city along the E22 roadway. one of the primary roads leading to the capital city of Riga, some 60 miles away. From his mobile command vehicle along the bank of the Iveksty River, Colonel Oleg Nagamov, commander of the Russian 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, eyed the drone data and video feed as it came in. Nagamov, who had just days before gained the nickname the Butcher of Latvia after his authorized massacre of surrendered NATO troops in Rēzekne, was pleased with what he saw. The roadways and terrain ahead were clear as the last of the NATO forces in the area retreated. The short, swift battle for Vilnius was over. Though anticipating increased resistance as they approached Riga, he remained unwavering in his conviction about the eventual outcome. "If the skies remain contested," he predicted, "Riga will be ours within 36 hours. Nagamov glanced down at the alarm on his watch. His command vehicle had been parked for 10 minutes. It was time to move from the potential eyes and ears, including on the electromagnetic spectrum, of NATO and the reach of their precision missiles. As he prepared to leave, a flash message arrived. It read in part, "Confirmed US 173rd on the ground near Riga." Nagamov grinned. The Americans' airborne arrival in the Baltics was not unexpected. On the road to Riga and victory, the Butcher of Latvia looked forward to greeting them. While Russian forces advanced to meet the US 173rd in Latvia, units from the US Marines' 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit in Estonia moved east of Tallinn to link up with Estonian and NATO units near the village of Vilnius. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Josiah Pryor arrived to find his counterparts bruised, bloodied, and preparing for a full retreat after having lost the city of Rakvere hours earlier. Channeling an officer's famous quote during World War I, an impatient Pryor was heard to bellow, "Retreating? Hell no. We just got here." What followed were 12 hours of heavy and brutal fighting, with Marine-led rocket and tactical ballistic missile strikes, followed by air support, infantry-fired anti-tank missiles, and close-in small arms fire, at first slowing, then stalling the Russians' armor and mechanized infantry near the village of Kharmu. Losses on both sides were considerable, with vehicles, aircraft, and bodies littering the woodlands and fields along Highway E20. While to the west, Marines, along with newly arrived leading elements of NATO's Rapid Response Task Force from the UK, Spain, and Poland, moved southwest of the Estonian capital to meet Russian forces threatening western Tallinn from their foothold at the Amari Lennubas airbase. Soon, with Russian air defense systems suppressed or destroyed, US and NATO aircraft began to systematically eliminate enemy forces dug in, while Russian airborne units to the north found themselves cut off and encircled in the town of Kea. 180 miles south, Colonel Nagamov was unaware of the violent struggle taking place in Estonia. He and his division, along with the entirety of the 1st Guards Tank Army, were busy with troubles of their own. Tasked with advancing north on the A6 expressway and using the widely adopted doctrine of bots before boots, the drone battle was not going well for Russia. Though their air defense systems blunted many of the incoming UAVs, it was the US's use of AI-operated, pack-hunting ground vehicles that was new, terrifying, and deadly. War correspondent Harry Ridgway found himself and his videographer on the front lines of the robotic war near the small Latvian village of Klidzaina. He described the experience. "First came the Russian unmanned recon vehicles that passed by us, heading north," said Ridgway. Seconds later, all of them were simultaneously hit. That's when we saw the American drones that had been leapfrogging in the tree lines. As they moved south, it was eerie and deeply unsettling watching them, knowing they were thinking, operating and killing, all on their own. Still in the prototype stage of development and few in numbers, the Manx-class drones moved on, hiding and bypassing the Russian armored units to locate and destroy the more critical fuel and supply vehicles. By late afternoon, Russian units had reached the town of Kegums, important in its access across the Daugava River. The plan was for Nagamov and the second to cross the Daugava and establish a footing, allowing forces to proceed and threaten the western side of Riga. But it was not to be. Inside a pre-war command bunker in Tallinn, specialists from Estonia, America, UK, and Denmark, coordinating with intelligence agencies across NATO, were actively listening deep inside the Russian military's secure communication networks in the Baltic theater. In particular, inside Nagamov's 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division. Not only did NATO know the division's planned route, they knew precisely when it would be most vulnerable. With the way seemingly clear, nearly a quarter of Nagamov's vehicles had crossed the dam when a hail of incoming missile and rocket fire destroyed the dam's roadway, as cluster munitions tore the trapped vehicles on the opposite side of the river to pieces. A Russian soldier was heard to shout, "When the hell do we actually get to see and fight the enemy?" As the day ended, the Russians' drive to Riga ground to a halt at the Oga River as critical supplies and reinforcements were called in. How long that pause would be remained to be seen. Back at Kegums on the eastern bank of the Daugava River, Colonel Nagamov quietly seethed, his mission delayed. His only solace was in the knowledge that both sides had expended a tremendous amount of supply. Supply he believed the Russians could quickly and vastly replenish, and that the small NATO force on the ground in the Baltics could not. Despite the momentary setback, the Butcher of Latvia was confident that time remained on his side, that his forces would break through and crush the thin NATO troops on the ground before the Americans could arrive in Europe in force. All that was required was one final, merciless push to take Russia to victory. Meanwhile, to the north, 45 miles east of Tallinn, Marine Sergeant Derek Campbell and his rifle squad from the 26th MEU were in the fight of their lives. Though the Russian advance had been momentarily interrupted to the north along Highway E20, that was not the case just a few miles south. With the collapse of defenses in the city of Rakvere hours earlier, Russians were now pouring down Highway 5 in their attempt to seize the small town of Tapa, its critical railway hub, and Tapa Army Base, the largest in the country. Earlier, Campbell and a company of Marines had arrived in Tapa to delay the Russian advance and allow time for the last remaining Estonian military and NATO personnel, their families and whatever equipment could be taken, to evacuate west to Tallinn. Now, with Russian artillery crashing down around them as tanks and armored vehicles poured out of the tree line a half-mile away, Campbell and his squad let loose their deadly Javelin anti-tank missiles, sending enemy turrets flying and vehicles brewing in the open, vulnerable terrain. Simultaneously, indirect and air support fire tore into the advancing vehicles, obscuring the field in dust, fire, and smoke. Yet soon, like apparitions, more vehicles appeared and closed in, though much more hesitantly, giving the critical time needed for those at the Tapa Army Base to evacuate, and for Campbell and his squad to safely withdraw. It had been a successful operation, with surprisingly few casualties, yet the mood was bitter. As they bounced along the roads back toward Tallinn, an angry Marine vented to Campbell. "If we'd had more javelins and rockets," he said, "we could have held that ground indefinitely." Campbell agreed, but with battles raging across the Baltics, having enough of anything was proving increasingly difficult, and it was only getting worse. As the war in the Baltics raged into its 5th day, at the US Ramstein Air Base in Germany, General Erich Radik, head of US European Command, met with Deputy Head of Allied Command Operations, UK General Sir Frank Vrabe, and on a video feed, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, US General Alan Bellomo. As a constant stream of heavy-lift aircraft arrived and departed, turning Ramstein into the busiest airport on the planet, Radik had called the meeting to discuss his most pressing challenge: logistics. Though NATO's air defense network was adequately repressing long-range Russian missile attacks, and thus allowing supplies to reach Riga and Tallinn, getting those supplies out to units on the front lines was proving painfully slow and treacherous. "It's the last mile that's the problem," said Radik. Russian reconnaissance and attack drones were flooding the field by the thousands, overwhelming NATO's counter-drone systems, and thus opening critical supply units to attack. The need to keep supply lines adequately distributed was slowing down the whole process, and in turn forcing fighting units to fall back. "We keep punching the Russians in the nose," said Rēzekne. "We need to be chopping them at the knees." What he and General Vrede proposed was a large-scale attack on rail lines, key bridges, and known military logistics centers inside Western Russia in order to interrupt or sever their resupply efforts. General Belomo understood it to be a significant escalation. It was one thing to hit targets far from the public eye, as they had in the Arctic, or small individual unit targets, as in Kaliningrad. It was another to hit infrastructure within Russian cities. Rēzekne countered that an escalation was coming either way. That if things did not change, and quickly, his forces would soon be fighting from the streets of Tallinn and Riga. "The Russians will shell those cities to powder," he added. Hours later, authorization for the strike was granted, and soon some 70 aircraft from across NATO took to the skies in what was being called Operation Amazon. What they faced was daunting. Between them and their 24 designated targets was a buzzing hive of enemy aircraft, combined with Russia's most advanced integrated air defense systems. 4 initial waves of NATO aircraft led the attack, the first jamming enemy radar and communications, while the remaining fired volleys of air-to-air missiles, precision glide bombs, and high-speed anti-radiation missiles. The Russians soon detected that something was happening, but knowing exactly what, how many and where proved difficult while buried in a fog of electronic jamming. Combat aircraft were quickly vectored toward the threat, but being electronically near-sighted, the Russian fighters were unaware that dozens of air-to-air missiles were already heading their way, each guided to their targets by NATO early warning and control aircraft. One by one, the Russian fighters were either rendered into flaming debris or had narrowly escaped, but driven out of the fight. Meanwhile, over 100 Russian surface-to-air missiles leapt into the sky to swat down the incoming glide bombs, but in doing so, the radar sites became targets themselves for the anti-radiation missiles racing in at nearly 4 times the speed of sound. Above the Russian city of Kingisepp, civilians watched and cheered with each aerial explosion as contrails crisscrossed the sky. But they soon grew quiet as the wave of NATO missiles overwhelmed the Russian defenses and dove into their targets. Coordinating it all from over the Baltic Sea, a NATO E-7 Wedgetail sent updated data to the final wave of attack aircraft, indicating in real time which Russian air defense systems were suppressed or destroyed. As one operator put it, "We told them which doors we'd successfully kicked open." As NATO stealth aircraft entered the breach, a wave of precision strike missiles launched from western Latvia streaked high overhead for targets deep inside Russia. To avoid confusion that the coming attack was nuclear, a flash message was sent in Germany to the Russian Ministry of Defense. It read simply, "Imminent strike on targets within Western Russia are conventional only." The message ended, amusingly, "Have a nice day." Racing in, just south of Lake Pikva, F-35 pilots, Lieutenant Commander Sam Heaton, and Lieutenant Commander Heather Cooper, identified as Archer 1 and 2, made for the rail hub and highway bridges in central Pskov. Near Pskov, recorded cockpit audio captured the events of Archer 1 and 2.
1. Rifle.
2. Rifle.
Keeper confirms 500 in the air. Tally, another SAM launch. Same location.
2 defending.
1 defending 500.
3 more in the air. 1 break right, break right.
Enemy close.
Archer 1, still there?
1 egressing west.
Lieutenant Commander Heaton later described being both eminently focused and terrified during those final moments of the attack. In all, 21 of the 24 targets were struck, dropping bridges and severing highways and rail lines from the outskirts of St. Petersburg down to the Russian border with Belarus. 1 NATO aircraft, a Growler, was lost, its pilot and electronic warfare officer ejecting over the Gulf of Finland. Despite repeated attempts to locate and rescue the crew, neither would ever be found. After landing safely in Germany, Lieutenant Commander Cooper later remarked how that morning's breakfast was the best she had ever tasted. The sunrise, the most beautiful she'd ever seen. She was thrilled to be alive. At Ramstein, General Radek celebrated the mission's success, but held his breath as he and NATO braced for Russia's reaction. They did not have to wait for long. At Tucson International Airport, Morgan Air Flight 192, a passenger jet bound for Orlando, rolled down taxiway Alpha for a departure on runway 30. On board, 179 passengers and 6 crew. Inside the cockpit, Captain Byron Ritchie and First Officer Martin Munro ran through their checklists for the late afternoon flight. The air inside was in stark contrast to the stifling 118-degree heat outside, part of a high-pressure system covering much of the southern United States in what meteorologists were calling a blistering heat dome. Making preparations for takeoff, First Officer Munro reviewed the data received through the aircraft's flight performance system, providing him the necessary flaps, throttle settings and speed for takeoff based on the latest weather information.
Morgan 192, Tucson Tower. RNAV to Wildcat. Cleared for takeoff runway 30.
RNAV to Wildcat, cleared for takeoff runway 30. Morgan 192. Check thrust.
Thrust set.
82.5%. 100 knots.
Checks.
V1, rotate. Pull her up.
I'm pulling. She won't climb.
Come on, climb, climb!
A commuter on nearby Interstate 19 later described seeing the airline struggle to lift, like, quote, someone drowning and fighting to get to the surface. At 170 miles per hour, the lumbering aircraft snapped light poles and power lines before clipping the roof of an Arizona Air National Guard hangar. The doomed flight then rolled and slammed into the ground, spreading flaming debris across East Valencia Road, flattening cars, setting 2 manufacturing buildings alight, killing 12 on the ground and injuring dozens. Of the 185 souls aboard Flight 192, only 34 survived. As first responders raced to the scene, what no one knew in the moment, yet what the world would soon witness, was that Flight 192 was just the first crash in what would become one of the darkest days in US aviation history. In Moscow, a day prior to the crash of Flight 192, Russian President Dmitry Kozak held a meeting with his closest advisors. Kozak was near apoplectic over NATO's recent air and missile attack on bridges, railways and logistics centers deep inside Russia itself, news and video of which rippled across the country. Some of Kozak's most hardcore supporters, including more than a few media pundits, were calling for a severe response, some going so far as to advocate the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Despite his rage, Kozak was not suicidal, and had as yet no appetite to go nuclear. He did, however, see opportunity in the moment. With NATO's strike inside Russia, Kozak now had the provocation needed to not only hit the United States, but to do so in a way that would incite maximum fear and disruption on the American public, as to test their political resolve in their continued defense of the Baltics. "They believe the war is still on the other side of the world," said Kozak. "Let's bring it home to them." Born in a room on the outskirts of Moscow, implementation of the attack on America did not utilize bombs or missiles, but instead, a snippet of computer code targeting a critical vulnerability inside software written decades prior for the US commercial aviation industry. Once in place, the attack's effectiveness simply became a numbers game. At the moment of the cyberattack, more than 2,500 commercial flights were preparing to take to the skies across the US. The malware was not expected to affect them all, the code's designers estimating that based on weather, location, timing, and crew experience, approximately 1% of aircraft would experience the right conditions to cause a catastrophic incident on takeoff. 18 minutes after the code was initiated, Morgan Air Flight 192 was barreling down the runway to its destruction. Less than 1 minute later, Rapid Jet Flight 326, taking off from El Paso International Airport, slammed into a residential neighborhood near the end of runway 26 left. 2 minutes later, commuters watched in horror as a 737 freighter taking off from the Hilton Head Island Airport crashed into a motel a quarter-mile off runway 21. In less than 15 minutes, 10 commercial aircraft crashed upon takeoff at 10 different airports stretching across the southern and western US, killing 523 and injuring 3 times that number. Said one air traffic controller, "As news spread of each new crash, it became pure chaos. We didn't know if there were hijackings. We didn't know if there were bombings. We didn't know squat. We just knew planes were suddenly dropping like flies." At the Tampa International Airport, Clear Sky's first officer Tony Buccieri was the first to identify the cause, that the takeoff settings provided to him in the cockpit sent from the networked flight performance system were wrong. The system wasn't just subtly lying to us, he said. It was doing so in a way to kill us. As he would later testify before Congress, if I had put those settings in as it instructed, based on the temperature, winds and our weight, we would have run out of runway before getting off the ground. And we wouldn't have known it until we were at rotation speed. And by then, it's just too damn late to stop. As the magnitude of the event became clear, air traffic control centers across the US began declaring ATC 0, shutting down air operations for their sectors. Moments later, FAA National Operations Manager Reggie Jones initiated what was called SCATANA, an emergency plan that included the complete ground stop and ordering of all civilian aircraft to land at the nearest airports. Jones later described the sickness he felt, describing the moment as our September 11th version 2. Meanwhile, from air bases across the United States, scrambled military aircraft leapt to the sky, ready to fight, but unclear whom to fight or where. For a time, confusion reigned. As social media and news outlets exploded with updates, rumors and false reporting ran rampant. In Washington, D.C., reports of a car bomb near the White House turned out to be a simple car fire, while the sonic booms from scrambled fighters elicited a flurry of 911 calls across the country. By 8:30 p.m., nearly 4 hours from the start of the attack, 4,800 aircraft were safely on the ground, effectively silencing the skies over the United States. But not entirely. High over Pennsylvania, aboard Air Force One, President Dahlman and members of his national security staff plotted options for a withering response, as by then they were aware of both the cause of the attack and, based on intelligence, where the attack likely originated. A nondescript building in downtown Moscow, owned by the Network Security Research Corporation, a company that had but one client, the Russian GRU. The corporation and their numerous cyberattacks had been known to NATO intelligence for years, though counterattacks against them had never been kinetic. Until now. Dahlman, who was at his most quiet when most furious, said little more to his team than to make a firm directive. "I want that building flattened," he said. "I want it hit in broad daylight. I want Kozak to feel the floor shake beneath his feet." It was a tall order. Airstrikes were deemed too risky. Subsonic cruise missiles too likely to be thinned by Russian air defenses. That left one conventional option: hypersonics. 10 hours later, a US Virginia-class submarine in the Barents Sea released a single long-range hypersonic weapon, its very existence only recently publicly disclosed. As before, a message was sent to Moscow announcing that the coming strike was conventional only, even going so far as to naming the target, with the full knowledge there would be little time to react. With the weapon rocketing south at speeds nearing 13,000 miles per hour, and with a plasma cloud before it absorbing radar, the Russian air defense network around Moscow could barely see, let alone target the incoming threat, though dozens of missiles were fired in a Hail Mary attempt. At 9:28 a.m. local time, the weapon struck the 7-story building located in the Presnensky district, just blocks from the Moscow Zoo. In an instant captured on numerous videos, the building was leveled to ruin. As one witness described it, "If I had not heard the screeching sound of the missile coming in, I would have thought it was a demolition project. That's how precisely that building came down." How many were killed was never released, though US intelligence identified 217, of which 48 were military staff. The attack was deemed a success, though many in Washington quietly understood that against Russia's vast and scattered cyber warfare capabilities, the attack was only a setback. No one in the United States, including President Dahlman, felt a sense of satisfaction. There was only anger, and a new, hardened and grim determination to see Russia driven from the Baltics, and Kozak's rule brought to an end. Meanwhile, shaken by the ease of the attack's infiltration and proximity, including the shattering of glass mere steps from his office, President Kozak, pacing in his bunker 200 meters below the Kremlin, waited to be told when he could safely return to the surface. Far to the west, in the Lithuanian capital city of Vilnius, atop the roof of the university hospital, Sergeant Darius Matutis, a forward observer in the Iron Wolf mechanized infantry brigade of the Lithuanian armed forces, eyed the drone footage streaming in from overhead. It was not good news. His city was nearly surrounded. To the north, Russian airborne forces had successfully cut off the A2 and A14 highways, while hours earlier, armor and mechanized infantry units had finally seized the Vilnius International Airport after 2 days of brutal, close-in fighting. As the Russians pressed forward in their attempt to encircle and cut off the capital city, nowhere was more critical in the moment for both Russia and Lithuania alike than Ponari, a southwest neighborhood and hub of the last remaining highways out of Vilnius. And now Ponari was under serious threat as Russian units pushed northward along Highway A19. From his vantage point, Sergeant Matutis was calling in all the fire support he could acquire against the onslaught. But resources were frightfully thin, with NATO artillery units forced to divide their attention between Russian units attacking Vilnius in the east and those from Kaliningrad, threatening and harassing from the west. Acquiring timely close air support was proving even more frustrating, with air assets task-saturated from the northern tip of Norway to the eastern Mediterranean Sea. Suddenly, Sergeant Matutis heard an explosion to the east. His heart sank, knowing immediately what it must be. The Russians had just bombed the bridge spanning the Neris River, severing one of the few remaining routes out of the city. Almost simultaneously, Lithuanian and Allied forces in Ponari radioed that they were falling back, in fear of being overrun. Sergeant Matutis remembered thinking in the moment, where the hell were they going to fall back to? The defense of Vilnius was in collapse. Inside a Soviet-era bunker beneath the presidential palace, Lithuanian President Jonas Mitalas received the news from his forces in the field. His city was now essentially surrounded, and with several bridges crossing the Neris River targeted and destroyed, those defenders remaining inside Vilnius now had their backs to the wall as the Russians concentrated in the south for a final push into the heart of the capital. Mitalas's Minister of National Defense, Rytis Landsbergis, made it clear that the defense would not hold for much longer. "We're talking hours," he said, "not days, before fighting would devolve to street and house to house." "What about the Poles and the Americans?" asked the president. When could Lithuania expect reinforcements? Yet Mitalas already knew the answer. Despite the many public promises coming from Brussels, Warsaw, and Washington, the fact was, the cavalry wasn't coming anytime soon. Though there was significant fighting taking place in and around the Suwałki Gap, as well as near constant skirmishes along the Polish border with Kaliningrad and Belarus, the posture of the Polish and American ground forces remained defensive only. Unlike Estonia and Latvia, where NATO quick reaction forces had boots on the ground, Lithuania was deemed by NATO leadership as too risky an endeavor until significant forces could be assembled for a counterattack from Poland. And currently, a significant portion of those forces were only now gathering at ports across the Atlantic and Gulf coasts to board ships bound for Europe. "We're looking at weeks," said Landsbergis, "not days." The US State Department was recommending that Mitalas and his cabinet evacuate and form a temporary government in exile. "To live to fight another day," as their ambassador said. The US and its allies were absolute in their belief that later, once sufficiently in place, their forces would drive Russia out of the Baltics. But that was later. In the moment, Metalas was facing the imminent destruction of his 700-year-old city and the deaths of tens of thousands of his citizens. As he considered his options, a new message arrived. This from Major General Alexei Sleptsov of the Russian 3rd Motor Rifle Division, demanding that Metalas and his government surrender or face the annihilation of Vilnius. After a hasty and grim meeting with his cabinet ministers and military commanders, a final decision was made. Vilnius would be declared an open city, and soon after, Lithuania would surrender. But before that was to happen, Metalas and his cabinet would evacuate to Poland. An immediate request was sent to NATO headquarters. Within moments, that request blitzed across NATO leadership and was, for many, met with frustration. As one NATO commander put it, now they want out. Not 2 days ago when we advised when it would have been easy. Now we've got to do it in a city under siege. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, air operation planners already had a plan in place. Unfortunately, that plan involved units who were now no longer in play, the most notable being elements of the US 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, who were more urgently needed for a clandestine mission in Finland. Instead, the non-combatant evacuation operation in Lithuania was quickly taken on by the US Marines 22nd MEU, currently transiting the Danish Straits near Copenhagen. Hours later, 4 monstrous CH-53K King Stallion helicopters, along with 3 UH-1Y Venoms and an AH-1Z Viper attack helicopter, landed and refueled at an airbase outside of Rēzekne, Poland, for the low, dark and dangerous flight into Lithuania. Under the cover of darkness, pilot and flight lead, U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Nick Gless, call sign Yes Up, led the flight of King Stallions, with 2 of the Venoms stationed for contingencies at a holding location in a farmer's field east of the city of Elytus. Trailing behind Gless was a single Venom, acting as command and control by Assault Flight Lead, Lieutenant Colonel Cole Kinder, along with an escorting Viper. As the flight crossed the border into Lithuania, satellite, drone and aircraft reconnaissance swept the path ahead looking for threats, while combat aircraft made racetrack patterns in the sky, ready in a moment to support the operation. Simultaneously, 2 electronic warfare aircraft blanketed Vilnius in a digital haze. Thundering southeast down the Neris River Valley at just 25 feet above the water, the glow of Vilnius soon came into view, and with it, Lieutenant Colonel Kinder announced a troubling new update. Ground team is reporting sporadic fighting with Russian sabotage units inside the city. Gless remembered thinking, then let's hope the good guys have cleared us a spot because we're wheels down for 60 seconds and not a second longer. The good guys he was referring to were a combination of Lithuanian Special Operations Forces and operators in the Danish Jaeger Corps, each acting to secure the 2 chosen landing zones. The first, designated Rēzekne, was located in the Cathedral Square, just blocks from the presidential palace. Rēzekne would be the location to extract the president, his family, and key ministers. The second, a soccer field 2 kilometers to the west, Waldorf, would be the landing zone to extract members of Lithuania's Supreme Court and select members of parliament. Near Rēzekne, Jaeger Corps operator Lauga Farnes and his team held a commanding view of the area atop Gediminas Castle Tower, their presence drawing fire, but also providing his sniper team the chance to identify and retort. Over the radio, Farnes heard that the helicopters were 2 minutes out. From the direction of the presidential palace, he quickly spotted the president's convoy of armored vehicles racing for the Cathedral Square. Farnes and his team laid supporting fire as best they could. From the west, Lieutenant Colonel Gless and a flight of 2 King Stallions broke off for Rēzekne, skimming the rooftops as tracer fire erupted from multiple directions at once, though was as yet ineffective. Dropping into the Cathedral Square, the wheels of his helicopter had barely touched the ground when his Marines fanned out, securing the immediate area as the first vehicles of the convoy rolled in. For Gless, there was a moment of furious frustration as the president's security team argued with ministers about who would ride with the president. The issue was resolved with the crash of an artillery shell landing just a block away, sending everyone scrambling for the nearest helicopter. As his wheels left the surface, Gless noted the time. They had been on the ground for 58 seconds. Egressing west, word came that things were not going as smoothly at LZ Waldorf. One of the King Stallions had taken fire, and though there were no injuries, the helicopter was now stranded in the soccer field. With Russian units closing in and the Viper taking fire, Lieutenant Colonel Kinder determined that it was simply too late to bring in the Venoms from the holding site. Dropping into the field, he picked up what few people he could, but in doing so, terrible, fateful decisions were made of who would stay and who would go. Dodging away to the southwest amidst the tracers, Kinder called in an airstrike on the disabled King Stallion, giving just enough time for those left behind to flee, and for Russian forces to arrive in their attempt to secure the helicopter as a 1,000-pound glide bomb streaked in. By dawn, the leadership of Lithuania was safely inside Poland, but it had come at a bitter and controversial cost. Left behind were Lithuanian and Allied troops desperately retreating for Poland, along with those inside Vilnius who were either forced to surrender, scatter, or go underground. In the privacy of his makeshift office, an anguished President Mitalis was heard to ask more than once, "Did we do the right thing?" Time would tell. Near the Latvian village of Galeni, Canadian Army Captain Marcus Kellaway and his team of newly infamous Rēzekne raiders made their final preparations for a drone strike against the nearby Rēzekne airport, a location lost to the Russians in the initial days of the invasion, and who were now using it as a forward operating base for helicopter and UAV operations. The raiders' target was a temporary barracks at the airport where, according to local sources, Russian aircrew and repairer units were bivouacking. The attack required precise timing, as flattening an empty barracks would be both a waste of time and waste of the last remaining Russian Lancet drone available to Kellaway, taken from a stockpile pre-staged by the Latvian National Armed Forces long before the outbreak of the war. The planned attack, as had the others carried out over the past 6 days, also required a network of support, from Latvian partisans, providing local resources and intel, to the supply of equipment through National Guard units operating in occupied territory, to satellite intelligence, when they could get it, provided by NATO elements based in Riga. As Kellaway darkly put it takes a village to kill a Russian. Kellaway would have much preferred to use NATO drones for the attacks, ones with instructions preferably written in English. But that was not to be. The Latvians' theory was that the black market Lancet drones would be mistaken as friendly by Russian anti-drone systems. A theory that proved to be entirely correct, as over the past 6 days, Kellaway and his raiders had carried out successful drone attacks on Russian mobile command vehicles, SAM units, and fuel stations, all without a single Lancet lost to Russian countermeasures. Despite the successes, Kellaway confided that their efforts felt entirely insufficient, that he and his team were little more than a trivial harassment to an enemy who had massacred his comrades in Rēzekne. And with this last arrow in his quiver and fresh supplies yet uncertain, Kellaway had hoped for a mission of more significance. He was about to get his chance. As he prepared to launch the drone, he received an urgent encrypted message from friendly forces in Riga. It began, "Abort mission. Have something better. You're going to love it." Reading its entirety, Kellaway grinned. Loved it, he did. "24 hours earlier, before Captain Kellaway's aborted attack, 2 US Black Hawk helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the famed Night Stalkers, slipped low across the Russian border near the Finnish village of Hossa. The lead pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Mike Hedgecock, eyed the terrain ahead, a seemingly endless stretch of forest and glacier-formed kettle ponds without a house, road, or human in sight. 20 miles in, he guided his flight into a small clearing near a road west of the Russian village of Tungozera. In the darkness stood a man with a single suitcase. It took less than a minute for Hedgecock to land, gather his new passenger, B wheels up and disappear back into the night with his precious human cargo bound for Pudasjärvi airfield. Then a Gulfstream flight to a location at a CIA safe house near Oslo, Norway. There, 28-year-old Nikolai Pastukov, an information systems analyst with the Russian Federal Security Service, a man vehemently opposed to Russian President Kozak's unjustified war on Europe, formally requested asylum, and in exchange provided his CIA handler with the information he'd promised. Stored on a thumb drive were millions of FSB documents and volumes of data regarding surveillance and intelligence programs carried out by the FSB against the Russian armed forces, all at the demand of President Kozak, fueled by his distrust and paranoia of a potential military coup. Years later, Pastukov's CIA handler, Lawrence Brennan, would write in a memoir, "That day capped my intel career. For what that kid delivered were the very keys to the Russian kingdom." The information ranged from compromat of Russian military officers to network authentication codes, internal communications, shared documents, and GRU operations, processes, and contacts. It was by and large the most compromising breach of the Russian armed forces in over a decade. Within hours, the data was being analyzed, categorized and dissected by AI platforms in Langley, Virginia, and then disseminated to various US agencies, as well as to members of the Five Eyes Alliance, including intelligence and security entities in the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. In Ottawa, Canadian Security Intelligence Service analyst Sean Welsh received an alert that the incoming data included a specific name flagged by CSIS, that of Russian Colonel Oleg Nagamov. By then, Nagamov's atrocities in Latvia were well known, first to NATO, then most recently from public news reports. The FSB intelligence revealed that Colonel Nagamov, married with one adult child, also had a girlfriend, Tatiana Kudrin, a 22-year-old living in the Kuntsevo district in western Moscow. Nagamov's dossier included photos, messages, and hotel and gift receipts spanning over 2 years. The colonel's secret may have been simple political compromat for the FSB, but its value proved far more significant to CSIS. Welsh and an assembled team quickly went to work, using the latest intel in an effort to find, fix, and finish the Russian colonel. Coordinating with other members of the Five Eyes, including the American NSA, Nagamov's girlfriend, Tatiana Kudrin, became the focus of their attention. Both Nagamov and Kudrin were careful not to use cell phones to call one another, but through the mobile devices of Kudrin's mother, an encrypted communications app was identified as Tatiana's app of choice, one that had been breached by the NSA for some time. In Tatiana's account were numerous messages and photos sent by an unidentified contact that was quickly determined to be Colonel Nagamov. His most recent photo, sent only hours before, included the text, "My temporary getaway will be our home when this is over, my love." The image itself contained no metadata of its location, but the photo included enough features for image analysis systems to determine its exact location. A large house on the banks of the Daugava River near the Latvian village of Aizkraukle, a few miles south of Lielvārde. CSIS had their find and fix, but how to turn that into an actual strike proved more difficult than Welsh had expected. Lobbing a missile at the house was simple, but ensuring Nagamov would be there for the missile's arrival required 24/7 monitoring of the location. And with NATO forces task-saturated throughout the Baltics, getting persistent orbital eyes on target was a near impossible request. A colleague reminded Welsh of the most obvious alternative: the Canadian-led sabotage team born out of Nagamov's massacre, Captain Kellaway and his Rēzekne raiders. Hours later, Kellaway would receive his new mission. Thrilled at the prospect, he and fellow raider, Sergeant Roman Zioba, of the Polish Land Force 15th Mechanized Infantry Brigade, gathered their gear and through a network of Latvian civilians were smuggled to a rural area northwest of the town of Koknese, within striking distance of their target. As before, timing was everything. To monitor the location, Kellaway sent his last mini-drone armed with a camera and a small explosive device. The drone was far too small to effectively strike the house, but hidden from view, perching on a nearby power line with endless recharge, the drone could indefinitely watch the target house day and night. Hours later, Kellaway spotted his prey. Colonel Nagamov was there. Hoping for a larger impact, Kellaway first radioed a request for a missile strike from his contacts in Riga, but was told it could take 30 minutes or more. There wasn't time. It was clear from the live video feed that Nagamov was preparing to leave. Sergeant Zioba launched their one and only Lancet drone. For 7 agonizing minutes, as the drone made its terminal flight, Kellaway and Zioba watched as Nagamov's armored car was loaded, then as the colonel climbed aboard, and the vehicle began to drive away. As it turned onto the main road, the drone struck. Kellaway gave a hoot of triumph, but it died in his throat as Nagamov miraculously crawled out of the wreckage, badly wounded, but still alive. "F***," Zioba howled. "F***ing hell!" Kellaway remembered his mini-drone, armed with a small grenade-sized charge. From his VR headset, he took his last drone to flight. Deafened from the blast, Nagamov surely could not hear, but he could see. And what he saw was Kellaway's incoming drone. At first, Kellaway thumbed the controls for a kamikaze dive, but then he hesitated. For all the lives lost and families destroyed by this one man, his execution felt too easy, too quick. As Nagamov struggled to crawl to the house, Kellaway circled, just out of the colonel's reach. From his headset, and for one brief moment, Kellaway was certain that he and Nagamov's eyes met. He saw the fear in the colonel's eyes, a man who knew he was never going to reach the safety of the house. A man who knew better than most what imminent death looked like. Satisfied and done playing cat and mouse, Kellaway finally aimed his drone and drove it into his target. In an instant, the butcher of Latvia was dead. As the war continued to rage in Europe, in the Philippine Sea, 700 miles southeast of Taiwan, the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, the USS George Washington, flagship of U.S. Navy Carrier Strike Group 5, was battening down for an incoming storm, its aircraft recovered with flight operations likely hampered for the next 8 to 10 hours. Aboard the ship, Rear Admiral Richard Ward was deeply concerned, not by the storm, but by the steady stream of incoming and alarming intelligence reports regarding what appeared to be a mobilization of China's military forces on a scale never before seen. For weeks, US and Allied forces in the region had been monitoring the build-up and had quietly begun implementing long-since devised plans in the event China was looking to take advantage of the US and Allied commitments in Europe. For its part, statements from Beijing were direct, in that China was not on a war footing but simply adjusting for tensions in the region. As yet, US and Russian forces had not taken the fight to the Pacific, but Premier Howe made it clear that if circumstances changed, China was prepared to protect Indo-Pacific shipping lanes. Rear Admiral Ward, and many others from Japan to Hawaii and Washington, was not convinced. Satellite intelligence showed that the bulk of China's Coast Guard fleet were either at sea or preparing to be, while 5 different surface action groups, including a Fujian-class aircraft carrier, were already deployed along the coast from Hainan to Qingdao. For what purpose remained unknown, but alarm bells in Australia, Japan, the Philippines, and most of all the US were sounding. As the waves and rain pounded the USS George Washington, Rear Admiral Ward received a flash message, confirming his worst fears. It read, "China is announcing a full and immediate quarantine of Taiwan." Coming up in Season 2, the story of the next World War takes a turn to the Pacific as the conflict grows, exponentially. If you enjoy this series, please send me a YouTube thanks or join my Flat Circle History Patreon site, where you will get behind-the-scenes access, member-only content, or even have a character named after you. Plus, it will help out John, the one guy wearing all the hats needed to make this series possible. He's one busy dude. And as always, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And thanks for watching.